Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys had a great spring break. I hope you're well rested and ready to get back to school. So this week we are going to start the third section of the class by talking about conformity, and we're actually going to spend 2 weeks talking about conformity. So today we'll introduce the idea of what is conformity. We'll talk about some different types of conformity, and I think that you'll see that although we might not realize that we conform all the time. So the next 2 weeks we'll talk about conformity, and then we'll wrap up the third section of the class by talking about groups and how we are influenced by the people that are around us in a group setting. So this week you do have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m., so make sure to do that. Also, we are at the midpoint of the semester, and so this is a really good time to come and talk to me if you have concerns about your grades. So if you've not been doing well on the tests, or if you've not been taking the tests or the activities, this is a really good time to come by my office hours, to email me, to meet with me so that I can try to help you, that we have time still to turn that around before the end of the semester. So please contact me if you need anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, this week and next week we are going to talk about conformity. So before we can talk about conformity, we have to figure out what conformity is. Conformity is a change in one's behavior due to the real or imagined influence of other people. So when we're talking about conformity, we're talking about changing something that we do, something that we say, maybe even something that we think, based on some kind of influence from other people. And this is why we're talking about conformity in social psychology. The theme here is that we are very much influenced by other people, and conformity is a large part of that. When we're talking about conformity, it says the real or imagined influence. Sometimes other people specifically tell us what we should do, or sometimes they just sort of suggest it, or we feel like we know what people want us to do, even if we're wrong. Sometimes we can make mistakes here. But conformity is a huge part of our lives. Think about how many times you have conformed just since you woke up this morning, right? Think of some personal examples. One thing that I say in my in-person class is that you all wore clothes today, so that's good. If you drove here, you probably drove on the right-hand side of the road, right? Hopefully. Hopefully you stopped at red lights. Perhaps you didn't conform to the speed limit, but the idea is that we do what other people tell us to do, what we think we should do. Conformity is a huge part of our lives. Sometimes conformity is really, really good. Sometimes it is essential to our society functioning. Other times conformity, though, can be very negative, as you'll see as we go through this lecture. But conformity is just changing something about ourselves to fit what we see from other people. Now, we've talked a few times about the kind of culture that we live in, and we've said that we live in an individualistic culture. In our American Western culture, we focus more on ourselves, less on the group. Now, this means that we are less likely to conform than someone who lives in a collectivist society, for example. Right? So it says American culture stresses the importance of not conforming, celebrates the rugged individualist. So we talk about wanting to be unique, right? Sometimes we get a tattoo, or we dye our hair, or we wear something because we want to get noticed, we want to stand out, we want to be different. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about advertising, about how one of the ways that people persuade us to buy something is to convince us that it will make us stand out or it will make us different. That's not to say that we don't conform in our society. We obviously do, as I just mentioned a second ago. But conformity is not going to be as important in our culture. In a collectivist culture where your placement in the group is the most important thing and fitting in with the people around you is crucial, in that situation, of course, you're going to feel more pressure to conform because it's more important for you to be part of that group, right? It's going to hurt more if you're not part of the group. But conformity still happens in our culture, and we think about this a lot maybe during the adolescent years when we're in high school and we feel like we have to wear the clothes everybody else wears and have the phone that everybody else has and that kind of thing. But I don't think this stops when we get out of high school. I think conformity is an issue throughout our lives. So we're going to talk about two types of conformity, remembering that conformity is just a change in your behavior or your way of thinking or your way of speaking based on the influence of other people. So we're going to talk about two different kinds of conformity, and the first is informational social influence. The second of which we're going to get to later is normative social influence. So starting with informational social influence, let me give you an example. How do you know how to address a professor if you have never maybe directly addressed this person before? Like, what would you call me if you walked into my office hours? Sometimes people call me Dr. Brown. I don't have a PhD. I have a master's degree, so I'm not Dr. Brown, but sometimes people just want to call me Dr. Brown, Professor Brown, Mrs. Brown, or Kimberly. I don't know if I've told you guys yet. I teach 6 classes this semester, so I don't remember what I've told which class, but you guys can call me Kimberly. That's perfectly fine with me. That's my name. I did once have a student call me Homegirl. So let's not get that informal, but you can absolutely call me Kimberly. But not all professors are okay with you calling them by their first name. And maybe you don't know how to address a particular professor. How would you find out? Well, one way is that you could wait and see what your classmates do, especially if it's an in-person class and you're around your classmates. Just wait and see what they do. And if everybody in the class calls a professor a certain name, then you might call them that name as well. You are viewing your classmates as a source of information. You're conforming to them because you think they know what they're doing. Also, another example here, do you cut a piece of sushi or eat it whole? Usually when I ask this question in an in-person class, they say that you're supposed to eat it whole. I don't eat sushi, so I don't really know. But if you had never eaten sushi before and you went to a sushi restaurant and you didn't know what to do, what would you do? You'd probably wait till the people that were with you started eating, and then you would just do whatever they did, right? Why are you doing it? It's because you don't know what to do in that situation, and so you conform to other people because you think they're right. This is an example of informational social influence. The influence of other people that leads us to conform because we see them as a source of information to guide our behavior. So in this situation, I am conforming to what my classmate calls my professor or to the way that my friend eats her sushi because I genuinely think that they know more than I do about the situation and I trust their take on the situation. We conform because we believe that others' interpretations of an ambiguous situation is more correct than ours and will help us choose an appropriate course of action. So we legitimately believe that the other person that we're conforming to has got it right. And we don't know what to do, so we're going to do what they do, right? Let me give you guys an example of this. One time I was driving onto Mississippi State's campus, and there was a row of cars, and a car maybe 3 or 4 cars ahead of me swerved off the road. I still don't know what happened. But then after that, the 3 cars behind them, right in front of me, swerved off the road as well. Now, what I think happened was the person probably dropped their cell phone or spilled their coffee or wasn't paying attention or whatever, and they swerved off the road. But the cars behind them also swerved off the road. I think they thought that that person saw something that they didn't see. And if the first car doesn't want to hit it, I don't want to hit it either. And so they all swerved off of the road. I decided to be the rugged individualist, and I just kept driving because I didn't see anything in the road. But the idea was that we conformed. Sometimes when I teach a class, I will walk up to a classroom that I'm going to teach, and everybody is sitting outside. And I walk up to the door, and I open it, and it's unlocked. The first person probably just sat outside because they were not wanting to go into the classroom yet. They were on their phone or something, but everybody else walked up and assumed that the first person had checked the door, and so they didn't even try checking the door. They just assumed the door was locked. These are just examples where we conform to other people's behavior because we assume that they know better than we do, right? But as I hope that you've seen from some of these examples, this can backfire on us. Okay? So if informational social influence is going along with other people because we genuinely believe that they're right, this will lead to private acceptance. Conforming to other people's behaviors out of a genuine belief that what they are doing or saying is right. So when we see our friend eat sushi a certain way, this is just an example, but if we see this person eat sushi, we say, oh, okay, that's the right way to eat sushi. And so we do what they do because we think they're right. Private acceptance means that internally, we truly believe what they're doing is right. Okay? And we'll see that with the other kind of conformity, we don't always have private acceptance, but typically with informational social influence, we do. Like if we have the idea that we are going along with what someone else is doing because we think they're right, then we are truly going to accept what they say and probably continue to eat the sushi that way even if they're not there, or continue to address the professor that way even if we're the only person in the room, right? We genuinely believe that we're right. It leads to private acceptance. So conformity and task importance. So we know that we tend to conform to other people when we see them as a source of information, as we said with this informational social influence. So what happens when the task is really important? Will that make us conform more or less? Well, I have some research here for you guys, a research study It says eyewitness conformity when picking perpetrators out of police lineups. Now, this was just a psychology experiment. So this wasn't anyone like an actual perpetrator or an actual police lineup. But what they did was they brought in people and they showed them like a video of a alleged fake crime that they had taped for the person to watch. And then they asked them to, based on that video, based on what they saw, pick the right person out of a lineup. Now, some people thought this was very important to get it right because they were told that if they got it right, they would get $20. Like, that's fairly important, right? I mean, $20 won't get you a whole lot, but I mean, $20 is lunch, right? So it was more important to them. Other people were told this is just a psychology experiment. You're not going to get anything special for getting the right answer. So we tried to create two conditions here where we have one group that feels like it's important for them to get the right answer. The other group feels like it's not so important for them to get the right answer. Then we had Confederates come in and give incorrect answers. Now remember that a Confederate is, in social psychology, a researcher who is posing as a participant. So the Confederate comes in and gives the wrong answer, and the question is, will the real participant go along with the Confederate and say the wrong answer, or will they stick to what they think is right and say the right answer? What they found was, in the situation where they were going to get paid to get the right answer, people were more likely to conform. Now, why would that be? If it's important for you to get the right answer, why would you conform to what everyone else is doing? Well, probably the idea here is that they viewed the other person as a source of information. They thought that perhaps the Confederate saw something that they didn't see or remembered something that they didn't remember. And so when it was important for them, they conformed and went along with it. Now, in this situation, that's not very important. We're just talking about a psychology experiment here. But think about how this could impact the real world, right? What if we were talking about eyewitness testimony, where we're asking people, what did you see? In this situation, we would want to make sure that we interview people individually, not in groups, because we know that people tend to conform to what they hear other people saying, especially if they feel like it's important to get it right. So it's important to interview people one-on-one because we are influenced by the people that are around us. That's just part of human nature, right? Sometimes informational social influence can backfire on us and can actually cause problems. And one very extreme example of this is mass psychogenic illness. The occurrence in a group of people of similar physical symptoms with no known physical cause. So one example of this comes from the TV show House. I don't know if you guys watched House. It's really great. It's on Netflix if you missed any of it. But there was one episode where they were on an airplane. And it was a very long flight, like an 18-hour flight or something, and someone started having these symptoms of a very serious illness. And when everyone else on the plane found out about it, they all started having the same symptoms as well. And they thought that maybe there was some kind of mass outbreak of this horrific, contagious disease. Well, they actually ended up finding out that the person had gotten the bends, or whatever you get when you go scuba diving and you come up too fast. And so there was actually, oh sorry, spoiler alert. Okay. There was actually nothing contagious about the situation. So in that case, then why did everyone start having serious symptoms if there was no contagious disease? Well, they thought they were exposed to something, and so they had a reaction to it. As soon as they told them that there was no real contagious disease, everyone's symptoms went away. I mean, think about if you know anything about the placebo effect, right? You can tell someone that they're receiving a powerful drug and you can give them a Tic Tac. And in reality, they're not receiving any kind of drug at all, but they think that they are, and so they'll usually have some kind of reaction to it. The mind is a very powerful thing. And so we talk about an episode of House, but this actually happens in real life as well. There was a high school in Tennessee where a teacher thought she smelled some kind of gas leak, thought there was some kind of gas leak in the school. And so she told everyone, and they evacuated the school, and they sent like over 100 people to the hospital because they thought that there was some kind of gas leak or that there was some kind of mysterious fumes, and now everyone was very, very sick. Then, in actuality, they found out there was no gas leak. They went in and they checked and everything was fine. And when they told the students that there was no gas leak, everyone started feeling better. what had happened? Well, they viewed their teacher as a source of information. The teacher said that she smelled something, that she thought something dangerous was going on, and so they all just assumed the teacher knew what she was talking about, and they all panicked, and that's when this starts to happen, right? So there can be some very negative impact of conformity. So when will people conform to informational social influence? Well, we're going to have a slide for each one of these, and we're going to talk about what these mean a little bit in more detail. But remember that informational social influence is just going along with what other people say or do because we think they know better than us. So if the situation is ambiguous, we are especially likely to go along with other people. Ambiguous really just means that we're not sure what's going on. We don't understand the situation. Maybe we're a little bit confused. Also, if the situation is a crisis, we go along, and we'll talk about this. And, of course, if we think that other people are experts, then we think we can trust them, then we're more likely to go along with what they say. So, first of all, talking about the situation being ambiguous, this is very, very important. If you are uncertain, you will be most open to the influence of other people. So, if you've eaten sushi before, and you know how to eat sushi, then it doesn't really matter how you see other people eating sushi. You're going to eat it the way that you know is the right way. If you've talked to your professor several times before and you know how you address your professor, then it doesn't really matter to you what other people do. You know the right thing, okay? But if you've never talked to that professor before or you've never eaten the sushi before, then that's an ambiguous situation where you're not really sure what you're supposed to do. And in those situations, we tend to depend on other people to show us what to do, right? We are a social species, and this is important to us. It says the greater the uncertainty, the more reliance there is on other people. So with the situation with the gas fumes, I mean, that probably was ambiguous. The students didn't know what they were supposed to do, and maybe they didn't know what it would smell like or what it would be like if there was a gas leak. If there was a student there who perhaps had experienced a gas leak and knew what that was supposed to be like, then they probably would have been less confused and less likely to go along with the situation. So not understanding the situation makes us more likely to conform. One example that I give sometimes would be, what if somebody told you they were going to have a wedding or some kind of event, and they said the dress was going to be semi-formal? Well, what does semi-formal mean? I mean, I don't really know what that means. So in that situation, you'd be more likely to call somebody else that you know that's going and say, what are you wearing to this event, right? Because you don't want to show up not dressed up enough or dressed up too much. And so if you feel uncertain about the situation, you're most likely to look to other people. Also, if the situation is a crisis, usually you look to other people here because you feel like you need to respond immediately and you don't necessarily know what to do. Like, for example, if you were in a building and the fire alarm went off, right? So if everybody else was just kind of walking around slowly and not acting like it was a big deal, then you probably wouldn't act like it was a big deal either. But if everyone else was running and crying and screaming and panicking, then you would probably panic as well, right? We take our cues from other people in a crisis situation, right? Usually because it's difficult sometimes for us to think clearly when we're very emotional, right? Especially if we feel very anxious. And so if we feel scared or we start to panic, we don't know what to do, we look to other people. The problem, though, is that in this situation, every single person around you is also in a burning building. I mean, they may not be responding rationally either. And so this sometimes you follow people and they lead you in the wrong direction or they don't do the right thing. And so when the situation is a crisis, keep in mind that everyone around you is also in a crisis as well. So make sure that what they're doing is a good idea before you start following. Finally, also, we will succumb to this informational social influence if we see other people as experts. For example, it says if you're a passenger on an airplane and you think there's something wrong with the airplane, you're going to look for the flight attendant's reaction or the pilot, if you can see the pilot or talk to the pilot, rather than your other people on the plane, right, your fellow seatmates. Why is this? Well, because you assume that the pilot knows whether there's a serious issue. And the flight attendants probably know whether or not there's a serious issue. So you're going to look to them because you see them as an expert, right? Other situations, if your doctor tells you you need to start doing this or you need to stop doing that, you'd be more likely to listen to your doctor than you would maybe your roommate or your mother, perhaps. Although mothers are often experts on things, so you should listen to your mother. But anyway. So we tend to see people who have some kind of expertise. Maybe we listen to the person with the PhD, or we listen to the professor, or we listen to this person because we think that they know better than us. However, we have to keep in mind that sometimes experts make mistakes too, right? We are all human. None of us are perfect. And so sometimes even the experts get it wrong, right? Of course, if we lived in a perfect world, this wouldn't happen, but it does happen sometimes. So that's just something to keep in mind. So informational social influence was a type of conformity where we go along with other people because we think they are right. They think that they know better than we do. But that can't be all types of conformity, right? Because sometimes we do things that are dangerous or that are risky or sometimes just don't seem very intelligent. Why would we go along and do things that are not a good idea? It wouldn't just be informational social influence where we really think this is a good idea, right? They ask, your mother asks you, somebody asks you, if so-and-so jumped off the bridge, would you jump off the bridge too, right? Obviously, jumping off the bridge is probably not a good idea. So sometimes we go along and we conform even if we know that what the person is doing is not a good idea. So why do we do this? Well, it's normative social influence. Since humans are a social species, right? I teach a relationships class at MSU, and we talk about how much we need relationships with other people. And some people need these relationships more than others. Maybe it's just a personality, something about your personality that makes you want to spend more time around people versus not want to spend more time around people. But even the most introverted person still needs other people. They still need to spend time around others. And being deprived of human contact is stressful and traumatic. One of the worst punishments that we have is solitary confinement, right? Making us be alone with ourselves. And I know sometimes I'm not great company, so I certainly wouldn't want to be alone with ourselves. And so the idea behind normative social influence is that sometimes we conform just so we don't have to be alone. It says normative social influence is the influence of other people that leads us to conform in order to be liked and accepted. So that's the important thing here. We want to be liked and accepted. This type of conformity results in public compliance rather than private acceptance. And we'll talk about public compliance a little bit on the next slide. But normative social influence just means that we go along because we want to fit in. So maybe we drink what the other people are drinking, or we do whatever the other people are doing. We have to dress like other people are dressing because we want to fit in with them, because we feel like it makes us more likely to have a relationship with that person if we do what they do. Now, a lot of the examples that we automatically think of here are like the high school examples, right, where we have to fit in, where adolescence is a time that's awkward and uncomfortable for most people, and we're really trying to fit in and trying to find ourselves. But normative social influence can happen at any age, right? Even when we get older, we still want to fit in, right, with our family, with our friends, with our partners, with perhaps our coworkers, or with our boss, right? We want to fit in. And so even sometimes when we get older, we can still do things that maybe we don't necessarily want to do, right? Like, what if all of your other friends are going to a certain kind of restaurant and you don't like that kind of food? You might still go along anyway and maybe even eat the food just because you want to be with the people, right? So sometimes when it comes to normative social influence, we're going along with other people because we want to fit in. So we said that informational social influence leads to private acceptance, where we genuinely believe that we're right, that the other person is right. So public compliance, it says conforming to other people's behavior publicly without necessarily believing in what we are doing or saying. So when it comes to normative social influence, if I'm only conforming because I want to fit in, I might not think what you're doing is a good idea. I might not actually like the hairstyle that everybody else likes or the clothes that everybody else likes. But I publicly go along with it outwardly. I don't tell anyone that I don't like it because you want to fit in. So with public compliance, you're going along with other people even if you don't necessarily agree with them, right? And we had an activity a little while back about politics. We talked about different political beliefs and where those come from. Maybe perhaps you like a certain candidate and your friends don't. So maybe you don't tell them that you like that candidate. Or if they say, I really like this person, and you say, yeah, I like that person too, even if you don't. Why did you do that? Because perhaps you wanted to fit in. You didn't want to start an argument. You didn't want to have a debate with them. And so you just went along with what they were saying, even if you didn't agree with it. We've probably all experienced this at some point because we do like to keep our relationships steady and happy. And so sometimes we just go along with what other people want to say or what they want to do because we feel like that makes our relationships more stable, right? So, normative social influence, we're talking about just going along so we can be accepted. This leads us to a discussion of social norms. Social norms are the implicit or explicit rules that a group has for acceptable behaviors, values, and beliefs of its members. And so this is where I really wish that I could discuss with you guys and get your thoughts and your feedback. So if you can think of any examples of these, feel free to email me, come by my office hours and chat with me about it. But social norms are just rules of our society. So let me think of some examples here. Well, actually, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we can talk about examples that are specific to the South. And so I have always lived in Mississippi. I have visited other places, but I've always lived in Mississippi. And sometimes I have students who come from other parts of the country, and they tell me that the behavior is just very different in the South. We have a different way of doing things. So one example would be holding the door open for people, right? That's just something that we do here. We see that as polite. But once I had a student tell me that he held the door open for a girl. The girl walked through the door. She turned to the guy and said, "Just so you know, I have a boyfriend." Like, is it flirtatious to hold the door open for someone, or is that just good manners, right? But probably what happened is that she's from a different part of the country, and so the social norms or the rules for acceptable behavior are different there. In the South, you're supposed to smile at people. You're supposed to talk to people, right? It's a social norm to ask people how they're doing. You see someone like, "Oh, how are you doing today?" The social norm is to ask, but what is the correct socially acceptable response to that, right? If somebody says, "How are you doing today?" you're supposed to say, "I'm doing fine," or even maybe, "Well, it's almost Friday," or something like that. Or they can say, "I'm doing okay." It is not usually acceptable, depending on how well you know the person, to say, "Oh, wow, I'm so glad you asked. I've got about an hour's worth of complaints. Are you ready to listen to that?" Usually we don't do that. Sometimes even if we feel terrible, we still say, "Oh, yeah, I'm doing great," because that's what is expected from other people, and so we tend to do that, right? But think about how it would be different if you went to another part of this country, or even another country, how they have very, very different social norms. And so the rules of acceptable behaviors and things are very different in different places. So think about that. If you're going to be visiting somewhere, it's always good, if you can, to try to familiarize yourself with the social norms there, or the behaviors there and what they do, to try to prevent some disagreements or some awkwardness, right? Another social norm or rule for acceptable behavior is about eye contact, right? If we don't look someone in the eye when we talk to them, we usually don't like that, right? We feel like if someone's not looking at me, maybe they're shy, or they don't want to be talking to me, or maybe even they're lying to me. So we don't like that. We want people to make eye contact with us. Other cultures don't emphasize eye contact. In fact, it might seem rude if you make eye contact. But also, even though we like eye contact, there's also a time where it gets uncomfortable. And I usually do a demonstration of this when I teach this class in person, where I actually make eye contact with a student for 10 or 15 seconds. It doesn't take very long for the nervous giggles to start in the class, because it just feels uncomfortable. You're supposed to look at someone for the right amount of time, but if you look at them for too long, then you kind of creep them out, right? So there are these unwritten rules of how you're supposed to behave, and those vary from one society to the next, and so you have to be careful when you go to a new place, right? So the activity for this week, activity 7, give an example of a time you conformed. So it can be anything. It could be a large thing, or it could be a little thing. Just tell me a time you conformed, so you changed your behavior to go along with someone else. Tell me what happened. Tell me, was it normative social influence or informational social influence? So were you going along with them because you wanted to fit in, or were you going along because you genuinely thought that they knew better than you did? And then tell me, did it result in private acceptance? So, in other words, did you internally feel like what you were doing was the right thing? If you say yes here, then you're actually believing the other person. You are coming to see that what they're doing is the right thing to be doing. If you say no here, then maybe you're going along with them because you want to fit in, but you don't really feel personally, privately, internally, that it was the right thing to do. Okay? So if you have any questions about this week's activity, let me know. this is where I'm going to leave off the lecture. Next week we will pick up here and we will finish talking about conformity. So if you need anything, just let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.